Recent ransomware attacks in the headlines reveal attackers running amok on enterprise networks despite hundreds of solutions being deployed to stop them. What can be done to stop advanced ransomware attackers when they design their threats to circumvent specific tools in your stack? Active defense, as described by the MITRE Corporation, provides a way to proactively bring the fight to the attackers as soon as they get past the perimeter and before they can launch their attacks. Hello and welcome to this audio webcast titled Active Defense versus Ransomware Attackers, brought to you by Elusive, IDC, and IDG. My name's Tom Schmidt, Digital Content Director at IDG's Strategic Marketing Services, and I'll be the moderator for this webcast. Joining me is Frank Dickerson, Program Vice President for Security and Trust at IDC. In this role, Frank leads the team that delivers compelling research in the areas of network security, endpoint security, cybersecurity, analytics, intelligence, response, and orchestration, among others. Hello, Frank.
Hello, and let me extend my welcome to you as well.
Thank you. Also joining me is Wade Lance, Field Chief Technology Officer at Elusive. Wade has been developing new technologies in education, healthcare, and information security for more than 20 years. He has diverse experience in solution design for Global 1000 cybersecurity teams, with an extensive background in advanced cyber attack detection and a specialty in cyber deception methods and platforms. Welcome, Wade.
Hey, Tom, Frank, thanks for the time today.
We have a terrific conversation in store for our audience today, so let's dive right in. Wade, can you start off by briefly addressing what's on our agenda today?
Absolutely. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to spend a little time talking about the history of ransomware and some of the trending. That trending is going to be really helpful to kind of understand, where we're going and how we got where we're at. Then we're going to talk about kind of why current ransomware attackers are so successful in spite of current tools security teams have in place to defeat them. And then we're going to get real specific about some of the evasion methods that are used. That'll be a particularly fun part of the conversation. Then we're going to move to the anatomy of a human-operated ransomware attack. And this is a great area where we'll get fairly specific about the difference between commodity ransomware and the more advanced human-operated ransomware attack. Next phase will be about how attackers are really leveraging the identity and pathway history that they find in production systems, and how this information allows attackers to move throughout the environment undetected and persist for long periods of time. And then lastly, we'll spend some time talking about an active defense, and specifically how to leverage the principles in active defense to stop ransomware attackers, and in particular, these human-operated ransomware attacks, the ones that do the most damage.
Excellent. Thanks, Wade. So, Frank, can you start off by providing us with a definition of ransomware, as well as a little history that sort of illuminates how we've reached the situation we're in today?
Yeah, when you think about ransomware, when you look at it from a perspective of the classical definition of ransomware really started a long time ago. It was way back in 1989. It was distributed on floppy disks, right? And they had this thing called the AIDS Trojan. And to give you kind of a perspective, the person that sent it up theoretically was trying to raise money for AIDS research. And to unlock your computer, you had to actually physically send a check to a P.O. box, right? But that's give you a little perspective. And I always bring that up, right? Because we tend to focus on ransomware as like a recent thing, but it's not. As we go through time, we get into 2006, and once again, in 2006, we were distributing with floppy disks still. Then all of a sudden, we start getting more creative, right? And so the spread became a lot bigger. In terms of email propagation and the Zeus botnet in 15 and 16, now we started getting smarter about how we distributed this ransomware. We start talking about vulnerabilities and kill switches. In 17, 18, we started introducing things like Ryuk and Fin6 and TrickBot. And then we start talking about spear phishing. And then finally, as we get to 2021, now we're talking about things like Rebel and DarkSide and Doppelpayer, right? And we start talking about how we're distributing these things with even supply chain attacks, where we're talking about Kaseya. And so as we look at this, right? In a bigger perspective, there's two kind of key messages that I like to give as I look at this perspective. Once again, there's nothing new. Like, ransomware has been a long time. The second thing is our focus has been a lot more strategic. In the early part, I call it the spray and pray method, right? We're just spraying out. As we get later and later and later, we start getting extremely sophisticated in the way that we're discovering people. And second, we're getting much, much more targeted. Wade, are you seeing this exact same phenomena?
Yeah, you're all over it, Frank. The only thing I would add to that fabulous history is that, we're seeing that ransomware works, right? I mean, the reason it's been around for over 30 years is that it's effective, and that's not lost on the attacking community.
Yeah, when we talk about ransomware works, like, I love that because you just deadpan me into the next slide, right? Because I always take a two-step process when I start talking about perspective on ransomware. One is talking about the history, that it's been around a long time, it's getting more targeted. The second attribute, we start talking about the sophistication. And it's funny because, as Wade and I have talked about this in the past, we're kind of in violent agreement on this perspective of ransomware. And so if we think about, let's go back to 2006, right? And we talk about what ransomware was. The interesting thing about 2006 is they actually improved the encryption. And so we started using that 60-bit RSA publicly encryption, which made it a lot harder for us to recover our data and break that encryption. But we didn't stop there, right? We started getting more sophisticated. And so we started talking about command and control. We started adding to this ransomware. We started talking about, better forms of encryption. And then the key to ransomware was the advent of Bitcoin, right? So that we can anonymously start collecting ransoms, right? So it was the monetization. And when we think about ransomware, when the mainstream folks are talking about ransomware, they're almost thinking about this 2013 definition. Now, as we continue on, now all of a sudden we start getting sophisticated. Just 2 years later, all of a sudden we start adding these attributes: lateral movement, privilege escalation, right? We're even talking about burying code in the master boot record, right? So if you clean your computer, you can re-image it, you reboot it, all of a sudden, still there, right? We start talking about 2018, where we start talking about, now we break it up. We kind of have a supply chain where one half supplies the ransomware as a service. Like, I don't even have to write my own ransomware. Someone else will do that for me. Me, as a cyber miscreant, all I got to do is worried about penetrating the network. And so now we've got this division of labor. Some people are good at writing the code, and some people are good at penetrating networks. And then we start getting into things like evasion. And we modify services. We create backdoors. We steal identities. And, of course, we still improve the levels of encryption. And then when we get to 2021, we start talking about these things like multifaceted extortion, right? So where we're not only asking for a ransom to give you back your data, we're asking for a ransom so that we don't give your data out publicly, that we don't give it to your competitors. Then we reach out to your customers and go, by the way, XYZ Corporation was breached. Hey, if you don't want me to share your data, Mr. Customer of XYZ Corporation, we need a ransom. And then we start thinking, they start calling media. And they started shaming folks. And the attribute that I focus on here, and you'll notice in the big red numbers, you'll notice we go from $100, $200 to $1,000 to tens of thousands of dollars to hundreds of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars. And if we look at that increase in the ransom, the key important point here, it's not about necessarily the quote-unquote the ransomware, because the value of the ransomware is essentially about $1,000, right? The prototypical thing that we think of as what adds value here is the CNC encryption and the cryptocurrency. So what the heck generated another $999,000 in value? It's not the attack. It's not the software, the attacker, right? It's the methods and operations of better penetrating. It's when ransomware people discovered that, hey, when that computer that we encrypt happens to accidentally be connected to a network share, and that network share also gets encrypted, hey, we get paid. Oh, maybe we can increase our price. Oh, maybe we can exfiltrate data. So the emphasis here, at least for me, as we talk about this movement of ransomware, it's less about the attack, it's less about the software, and it's more about the attacker. Wade, do you agree?
Absolutely, Frank. And, one of the data points I love on this slide is that, about 2015, we start to see lateral movement and privilege escalation, defense evasion, backdoor creation, identity theft. And these are all elements of criminal enterprise attacks, right? We've seen these for a long time in other areas. And what's happened is that the criminal enterprise has seen in ransomware a tool that they can add to their toolkit. And, one of the things we've seen recently is that some of these attacks that have leveraged some ransomware have also hit cybersecurity firms, right? Organizations that even work in cyberspace. So, the level of threats going up. It's funny, you talk about the early days. I love the comment about the $1,000 encryption is kind of what the ransomware is worth. It had to be done on lots and lots of systems, lots and lots of victims. And the attackers have kind of learned, hey, I'd rather compromise fewer people and get a lot more money out of them than keep the scale down and be dealing with pocket change. And that shift, I think we're going to, see continue.
Yeah, and I love the point that you make here, because the secondary meaning, I would love to know your perspective, right? Because for me, I read one more secondary meaning into this, right? As we look at this, if we accept Frank's premise, and this is just my opinion, right? Other opinions are different, but if we accept my premise of the ransomware itself is worth $1,000 and all the rest of that adds $999,000 of value, then if you get attacked and the last part of that attack is we encrypt your data, well, if you discover the breach at the point of encryption, at the time of encryption, it's too late, because it doesn't matter if you block the encryption if your data has already left the environment. If you're already getting extorted, it doesn't matter if you can recover or not recover your data, because the value there is in the extortion and not the encryption. Is that a fair perspective?
It's certainly a fair statement. And look, security teams are happy if they can block the encryption, right? Yay. That part didn't happen, but boy, that doesn't keep your name out of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal listed as your data is being published, right? And a lot of organizations would be a lot happier sacrificing to encrypted systems than having, their data stolen, sold to their competitive organizations, or published, publicly. I think the point is right on. Really, again, that ransomware is just a tool in the attacker's toolkit. And I think your point is well taken, Frank, that if we focus on just blocking the ransomware, that alone is not going to solve this problem, and it's not going to take the pressure off of security teams to defeat this threat.
So, Wade, I think a lot of people are asking the question, what makes current ransomware attackers so successful despite all the available tools currently out there leveraged to stop them?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tom. And we're going to spend a little time on this because I think it's so helpful for security teams to have some clarity on why is this happening, right? Why, in spite of the tools that are specifically pointed at this solution, is the problem just getting worse, right? That's not what we would expect to see. And so a couple of drivers here are pretty indicative of, look, the security stack, best practices, a lot of folks working on that. And yet we still see some of these names being compromised by ransomware attackers, right? Ransomware attacks. And so some of the challenges here and the facets that we see is that the attack surface is expanding rapidly and becoming increasingly diverse, right? We used to have more control over environments inside the perimeter and the enterprise, but with the movement to, cloud and SaaS services and the work from home change over the last couple of years, which has just, been dramatic, this is making it much more difficult for security teams to get visibility into their vulnerabilities and the threats and where these sophisticated attackers can compromise their environment. The next thing is that perimeter defenses are really designed to stop the known, right? And so when attackers use living off the land methods and move silently through the environment, and maybe there is no malware until, right at the very end when I, break out some encryptor or encrypt a bunch of files, and it's very difficult to deal with the attacker that is bothering to just live off the land and use, slow and low attempts and methods. Where we have tried to respond as security teams around that has been, in many cases, around anomaly detection. And what we found in particular over the last few years is that security tools are very, very noisy, particularly when we use anomaly as the driving force behind the detection. Is this behavior weird or different or abnormal? And that creates a ton of noise. And Frank's going to spend a little time, talking about some of the specific pain around that. But, this option for attackers to hide in plain sight, security tools can be hard to monitor and manage, particularly when anomaly detection is a driving force. Correlating the data is very difficult. Sometimes it requires multiple data sets to be correlated at high speed to be successful. That's extremely difficult to do in the current security stack. And the result is, lateral movement. We talk all the time about lateral movement, malicious hidden lateral movement being difficult to detect. And the fact of the matter is, actually, we detect it all the time, right? Post-breach investigation reveals that in many incidents, the security team, quote unquote, detected the attacker. We have events in the log system that are indicative of this behavior. The problem is we can't differentiate it from normal. And so differentiating malicious lateral movement from normal user behavior is extremely difficult. And so all of this is kind of the perfect storm for security teams, and ransomware attackers are very aware of this and leveraging it to great success. Frank, I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of the particulars of these that you'd like to highlight.
Yeah, you hit kind of two or three of the hot buttons that I would mention, and I love the phrasing that you used, the living off the land, right? Because you've got that bullet point there, perimeter defenses are built to stop the known. I would even extend that, right? Most security tools are looking for malware or maliciousness, right? So when you start talking about algorithmic-based defenses, we focus on our ability to use machine learning to analyze a file and the attributes of the file and say, hey, is this indicative of a malicious file? And so sometimes that works out really well if you're talking a remote access Trojan or some kind of known malware. You mentioned living off the land, right? And so when we start talking about these penetration points, there's a lot of times that these intrusions aren't using any malware. They begin with some kind of compromised credential, and then they start leveraging things on your computer, like PowerShell. Talk about a powerful tool. It's not just the systems administrator leveraging PowerShell. The bad guys are going, hey, this PowerShell thing is pretty good, right? Let's leverage that. So how do you defend against an attacker when they're not using malware, right? When they're living off the land? And fundamentally, when you look at the typical security stack, they're focusing on malware. So when you start talking this, as you use the term, the human-operated ransomware, it's the attacker in your network, and let's call it the attacker in your network that's living off the land. There's a fundamentally different approach to discovering that attacker than if that attacker is leveraging malware. And I think, for me, that's the critical attribute.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Frank. Great comment.
So how do ransomware attackers evade all these tools? Frank?
I think there's a number of ways that they evade all these tools. And we touched on it last slide, right? They are very intentional in terms of way that they're trying to traverse their network. They're looking for an ROI. And so this approach, if we talk about this ransomware, if we stop thinking of ransomware as a noun, right? Start thinking of ransomware as a verb and looking at ransomware as it's an attacker looking to exfiltrate data, that's looking to encrypt, that's looking to elevate privileges, as we look at that as attacker using ransomware as a verb, then all of a sudden we start appreciating the complexity, especially as we're moving to multi-cloud. It's important to note, and we get to this slide, I say here the quality of the detections matter, because the most precious resource that we have in security are our people. We've all hit this problem. Like, we can discover everything if we alert on everything. But typically, a lot of organizations aren't addressing their existing alerts. And if you can't address, your existing alert, if you have the capacity to address 200 alerts a week, if I send you an additional 1,000 alerts, not to help, right? Because if I can only answer 200 and I'm not answering 200 now, not answering 800 is not going to make me any more secure. And it's not just about reducing the number of alerts. It's about this idea of prioritization. If I can get really strong alerts and move that up to the top. And so as we look at what's preventing our organizations from addressing all these alerts, we see many of the reasons here. We talk about there are too many false positives, right? We have too many alerts. Things are overly manual. It's a manual effort to try and combine all these multiple alerts into a single incident. Because we've seen this. As ransomware attackers are going through our network, we're setting off multiple alerts. And so we may have 3, 4, 5, 6 alerts. And maybe those are 3, 4, 5, relatively benign type of alerts, in air quotes. But if we combine those, we get a vision of, oh my gosh, like we're seeing this escalation, we're seeing movement, we're seeing all this, but it's just too much work for our people. Sometimes we see so many alerts that we don't even believe the alerts. And so we struggle with this manual effort of having to deal with the quality of the alerts. Now, it's not just theory, right? Because as we see here, number 4 here is the belief that unaddressed alerts aren't really that important. Maybe they're not indicating something. But as we look at the data, we've seen that there's a direct correlation. It's intuitive, but there's a direct correlation between the number of breaches and the number of uninvestigated alerts. Now, that is challenging. I'm not necessarily implying causality. I am implying correlation. There is a reason. And so some of these alerts are indeed indicating something malicious. Maybe I'll push it back to Wade in terms of this alert challenge, right? Wade, as you engage with customers, are you seeing this alert challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. It's exhausting. And it's actually one of the biggest issues for security people is just exhaustion, right? I mean, getting days off and the volume of information. And I think security teams are doing what they can around automation and correlation rules and, orchestration. And that's all great work that needs to be done. But the reality is that the quality of the data feeds are going to determine the quality of the alerts, right? We've got to get better at differentiating malicious from normal behavior so that we can focus in on the poison needle in the needle stack, right? There's no way that human operators, even using automation and correlation and all that, can see through this. And, we've seen it time and time again that major security breaches are tied to uninvestigated alerts. The data's in there. We just couldn't focus on it, prioritize on it. And machine learning and artificial intelligence is not there yet to just solve that problem for us. And it can reduce the overall load, but it's not the silver bullet. And so this is, I think, the good news about today's discussion is that the active defense is designed specifically to overcome this problem. And we're going to talk about that in more detail going forward. So let's talk about another element about ransomware attackers evading the tools that we have. And a very helpful part in breaking this down is to think about attacker sophistication in 2 different phases, right? So there's the breaching phase, where how does one get a beachhead on a host that they can use to target an environment? see here in the grid that there's a lot right now of public RDP being exploited for this purposes. There's obviously software vulnerabilities are an option, phishing campaigns, and some other methods. What we know about this is that this will change, right? This is not static. And if we solved our public RDP problem and patched all the vulnerabilities, that won't solve the problem because attackers are developing new methods, right? And they'll simply respond. So there's, part A, how does one get a beachhead? And we need to do the best we can to keep the security organization effective in these spaces. But part B is, what do we do? How does the attacker bypass the controls of EDR and EPP in the system itself, right? And so we can see here kind of the consistent process. Once an attacker gets a beachhead, they're scanning for executables and security controls, bypassing EDR and endpoint protection tools. We've seen that in a number of public breaches, downloading code or customizing code for systems, dumping memory, using off-the-shelf tools, things from Mimikatz or, say, Windows Credential Editor, right? A great tool for this kind of function. And so what we see is that attacker sophistication allows them to bypass these tools on the one hand in order to get a beachhead, but then on the second hand in order to move throughout the environment undetected, because the attacking community is very aware of our security capabilities. When they get a beachhead, they simply introspect that host and determine what tools are on it. I've got an example here of the anatomy of a human-operated ransomware attack. And we had a customer, leveraged our capability and deployed it in their environment in order to get an active defense. And very quickly, we began to get alerts, I think, on the second day from some lateral movement in this environment that was clearly malicious. And when the attack was deconstructed and the forensics were run, we understood what had happened, right? There was a phishing campaign and some DLL injection on the initial system. The attacker then jumped from that system into a print server. They leveraged Cobalt Strike and an IP scanner, Bloodhound, LSAS memory dumping, compromised privileged credentials. Then they used WMI and RDP for propagation inside the network, moved against crown jewels, and were detected because by that point we had been deployed, detected, and shut down. What was interesting was, you say, wait a minute, where's the ransomware part of this attack? Well, as it turns out, in the attacker systems where they had compromised systems, as part of their toolkit, the forensics team detected that there was ransomware executables in the attacker's toolkit. They had chosen not to do the encryption yet because they hadn't completed the process. Right, we had detected them in the process of moving through the environment and were able to shut this attack down before they were able to exfiltrate data or encrypt anything. But we understand because of the toolkit that this was a human-operated ransomware attack, which I think is kind of indicative of how we're seeing this play out. So, Frank, love to get your thoughts on this part of the process and this idea of the focusing on the attacker rather than just the toolkit.
I think there's two things that jump out at me, and maybe they're anecdotal and maybe they're not. The first thing that jumps out at me, to your point, Wade, we're almost at the end of the whole attack cycle, and we still haven't actually encrypted anything, right? We are looking, we're attacking, we're doing reconnaissance, we're trying to figure out what's going on in the network. We're laterally moving for, as you say here, IT crown jewels. We're looking for those things that are most valuable. And by the way, that's not all that easy, right? It takes a lot of work. Some of the IDC data that we've seen is that, as we survey, sometimes the attackers find what exactly they want, and sometimes they're challenged to find. So it's a lot of work that they're investing to get here. The last thing that happens is the encryption. And so what's creating the value once again? It's the initial intrusion, it's the lateral movement, it's the privilege escalation, it's the exfiltrating of data, all those things, and we have yet to see any encryption. The second attribute that I marvel at, and I was listening to some other experts talk about the whole idea of nation-state attacks. And if we go back in the 2011, 2012, 2013 timeframe when we had Stuxnet, right? And all of a sudden, boy, wasn't Stuxnet a great tool to teach the bad guys how to exfiltrate data or how to attack a network? And we had this movement of nation-state tools going to attackers. Now, as we look, nation-states are now starting to leverage the bad guys' attacks. They're starting to use commodity ransomware. They're starting to use ransomware as a service. Why? Because it's more covert. Like, how can you tell if it's a nation-state attack if we're leveraging, these ransomware as a service? And why are nation-states being able to use it? Because it's this sophisticated. And so the emphasis here is what we might have think of as that commodity spray and pray ransomware of 2013. That's history, and it's long gone.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Frank. And what's the challenge, I think, for some security teams is that they still occasionally detect old school ransomware attacks. I mean, this still happens, right? And their endpoint controls or a network control detects some of that, and they clean it up and they go, hey, yay, great. We're detecting ransomware and we're preventing it. And so we're good. And, this human operated attack that also leverages ransomware is as we've described, a completely different animal. So quick note here on, just some interesting data about ransomware families, tools, tactics, and procedures. Here's just 5 common families, and notice the blocking and tackling where there's consistency across these methods. And again, this is not tied specifically just to the ransomware. It's the attacks that are leveraging these ransomware families, right? So credential harvesting, completely consistent, right? That is being used very consistently. The tools involved in some of this, everything from Bloodhound, Cobalt Strike, PowerShell Empire, others, we see a lot of tools, SharpHound, very popular. Native Windows tools, Windows Credential Editor, always a favorite. But look at the bypassing, right? EDR and endpoint protection bypass now becoming more common than not. I think Frank's point is well taken. The line between the criminal enterprise and the nation state has really kind of dissolved, and those methods are being shared. And ransomware is now just a tool in the toolkit of people who are, pretty good at what they do with malicious action.
Wade, let me get a little more technical. How does residue identity and pathway history on host make hidden lateral movement easy?
Yeah, look, all of these tools and all of these systems are leveraging that data, right? That's what they're using. If we don't, as security organizations, get more effective against how we monitor and manage this residue, attackers are going to continue to be successful with these methods. And that's part of what an active defense is about, is helping us take a hard look at these processes around credential residue and connection pathway history and using that to our advantage. One of the issues here is about detection time. And so let me just toss it back over to Frank to talk about the impact of detection times and the time to detection and how that's creating opportunities for attackers as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as we think about detection times. If you detect ransomware or you don't detect ransomware, you would think binary, like I detected it, so that's great. So why does the time matter? The time matters because time is a source of a measurement. It's an ROI. And so detection times mean that in this instance, if you're in that less than 1 hour it takes to detect a particular piece of ransomware, that's indicative of how long it takes you to clear alerts or how long it takes you to do a complete investigation. And so if I can detect something in an hour, well, that means I've got capacity to do 8 of those a day. Now, if you're in that group where it takes you 4 hours to process all those alerts, to compile your research, to figure out the attack paths, now you can only do 2 a day. And if you're in that poor category that takes you a day or more just to funnel through your network and your cybersecurity tools, then what you're going to find is that you're going to be able to process less alerts. So it's not necessarily the length of time it takes you to validate that you have a detection. It's the length of time it takes you to be able to process all of those alerts and triage and go from a level 1 analyst to a level 2 analyst. It's about capacity. And so sometimes it's not necessarily about efficacy. Sometimes it's about efficiency, and efficiency is almost sometimes the same thing as efficacy.
Yeah, great points, Frank. And I think that takes us to how, again, attackers are leveraging this pain point, which is through raw speed, right? If detection, it goes back to Frank's comments about capacity, right? How quickly can we churn through the information as a security team to get pointed at what matters? Well, apparently, most security teams are not able to churn through the data and differentiate between normal network operations and anomalous and yet normal network operations versus malicious attacker activity, hidden malicious lateral movement, and privilege escalation in these kind of processes, whereas the attacker is very fast at this. They now have automated tools that help them work this circle very quickly and very efficiently. And because they're faster at account takeover, privilege escalation, identifying the next host, moving to those systems, they're simply walking the process faster than we are as security teams with the given processes. And this is how, by the time the security team is figuring out what's happening, in many cases, the data has been exfiltrated out of the network. Very sensitive systems have been compromised. And in some cases, the attacker is also able to ransom key systems. And so this speed, attacker using automation against the security team's manual methods of investigation and alert triage and getting to actual point of detection. It's like, yeah, great, we detected it, but we detected it after the data was exfiltrated and critical systems were encrypted, so that's not much help.
Yeah, and if you look at this process, and I love this flow chart, right? Because this is essentially what attackers do. They do some reconnaissance, they harvest some credentials, they move laterally, they elevate privileges. And then they do it again. They do a little bit more reconnaissance, they harvest credentials, they move laterally. And they do this cycle and this cycle and this cycle, right, as they're progressing through your network. And yes, they're doing it quickly, but the other thing to note, it's quiet. It's not like a massive, somebody's at your front door, banging on your door. You don't necessarily hear it. They're not breaking down your front door. They're waiting until they can find a key and they open the door. And then they go to the next room and they look for a key and they open the door. And it's very quiet. And so as we look to triage these alerts and we look at these investigations, it's important to note that the incident investigation time matters. This is data that comes from our EDR and XDR surveys, right? It's interesting, as we talk to security professionals, they know exactly how long it takes them to investigate alerts. And when we start talking about incident investigation time and breaches, once again, we see a correlation, right? The longer it takes you to triage and investigate alerts, the more breaches that you have. Now, it's important to note, and some of you are in the audience are now thinking to yourself, hey, it doesn't, time to investigate alerts doesn't cause security breaches. No. We're not talking, once again, about causation. We're talking about correlation. And there's a number of attributes, obviously, that go into creating this length of time. But clearly, the more complex your network, the harder your tools are to use, the longer it takes you to investigate and triage an alert, the less alerts you can triage, and the more breaches that you have. Wade, you're seeing this, right?
Well, absolutely. And it's not just the more breaches you have, but the longer these go, the bigger the impact of the breach. It's if you're not quick about this as a security organization, it's the difference between a few systems being, compromised or a large number of high value, mission critical, sensitive systems being compromised. So, the line on this slide that's so important is that idea of a major security breach. If you're fast, then as a security team, you'll have some detections because you will be compromised, but you'll detect it and you'll clean it out and it won't be a giant big deal. If you're not faster about this process and it takes too long to investigate the kind of breaches you're going to have more small ones, but you're also going to have major incidents with serious consequences. That's the result of being slow at this process. And the attacking community is well aware of how to do that, right? Live off the land, use the credential and connection information that I find on the system, leverage that information to move quiet throughout the environment and make it hard for the defending team to work this process.
Yeah, Wade, it's a great point you make, and you call that word major, right? So when we survey, we focus on major security breaches, and the definition that we give those security professionals is a breach that causes you to expend extra resources to remediate, right? These are the breaches where you're like, oh, crap, like you're calling in some sort of IR team to help you try to get through this. And if you think about breach, and sometimes I get really picky about the term breach, right? Because sometimes we define it as data being exfiltrated. But the time, even if zero data is exfiltrated, the length of time it takes you to discover these alerts and discover these intrusions are incredibly important. Like that example that Wade showed earlier of that attacker that got all the way through the network and they didn't have a chance to actually exfiltrate data. That team still got to go back through all of their systems and start pulling out all of that data. And the thing about cyber miscreants now, they're really good at finding and hiding things, creating backdoors as they go. So just because nothing was exfiltrated, just because ransomware wasn't clicked, doesn't mean you don't have a ton of work ahead of you. So clearly, the sooner you can discover, that network penetration, less work you got to do.
Good points. Okay, Wade. So here's the question that's on everyone's mind. How do you build an active defense strategy to stop ransomware attackers?
Yeah, it's a great question, and let's dive right in. So, the modern security stack, really, there are specific processes and deficiencies, gaps that we need to fill in order to transition from a reactive defense into a proactive security posture, right? How do we turn the tables? That's the way to get ahead of these kind of sophisticated human-operated ransomware attackers. So the first piece in the structure is to proactively identify pathway and credential and identity hygiene issues in the environment on a continuous basis, right? To examine your environment host by host continuously and say, where are the credentials stored in my environment that if an attacker got a hold of, how they would leverage that information to move silently in the environment. Where are browsers storing credentials to applications? Where are service accounts misallocated and not being managed correctly, or service accounts given permissions to log in interactively? There's all these use cases. Again, this is not detection, this is prevention, right? Consistently and continuously examining the environment, looking for these conditions, workstation by workstation, server by server. It has to be automated, obviously, to increase your hygiene position so that there aren't a lot of goodies laying around for an attacker to leverage. As long as this information is laying around and reusable by an attacker, we will simply never get ahead of this process. The next step in the process is, having an active defense is going to mean that we're going to have to use some agentless capabilities. If what we're doing is dependent on yet another agent on the endpoint, not only will it be unpopular, by IT operational teams, but it puts us in a position again for the attacker to simply disable this capability as a part of their process. The attacker will identify the agent, they'll disable it, they'll use it against the security team. We've seen that in the past. We've seen attackers that intentionally, they'll identify one beachhead in an environment and then have others as well. Frank talked about the attackers, leaving these backdoors and different hosts in the environment. And then when they're ready for a sophisticated part of the attack on a system where they know there are monitoring agents, they'll create a bunch of activity with the intention of being detected. So that the security team's attention will all get focused on the system that now is alerting with a bunch of interesting malicious activity, and everyone gets all excited about the detection and goes to respond and clean up. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the environment, the attacker is moving silently to exfiltrate data and take other actions on completely different systems. So thinking long and hard about an agentless approach to your active defense strategy is an absolute must if we're going to get ahead of this process. The next step in the process, and we talked about this in the issue around seeing through the alert noise, is to get early detection of lateral movement using deception as a method. And again, this is not old school honeypots spread out and around throughout the environment. This is deception functions that exist on the production systems themselves, on the workstations, on the servers, proactively planting and telling deceptive stories, meaning that when the attacker goes to leverage the living off the land method and they go to reclaim credentials and do privilege escalation and reuse connection history, most of the information that they'll be getting is deceptive information. That's part of an active defense, is using automation to feed the attacker misinformation. And when they use that information, we've got a very high fidelity detection event which says, hey, someone on this system violated security policy to even find this information, and then they attempted to use it in a lateral movement. This is a very easy, high fidelity alert that the security team will be very grateful for in the process. I want to draw your attention to the MITRE shield structure, because MITRE is doing a lot of the groundwork on really defining an active defense and how one builds out these structures. And so notice here in this grid that everything that you see with kind of that teal color and the dark font, all of these methods for each of the different facets within the shield active defense structure require a deceptive process. And if you just look at the visualization here, you can see the extent to which deception is becoming a requirement in order to claim an active defense. What's interesting about this is that the shield structure was only released in 2020. I think it was about this time or maybe a little earlier last summer. And MITRE has already evolved this concept of shield into the engage structure, right? They're continuing to develop this and adapt this because it's so impactful in production environments where customers are taking these actions and using this process to cut through the alert noise. Deception, as we can see, is a critical element of this process. The last piece in the process is indicative of an active defense, is really to streamline incident response processes and containment with a number of methods, with security orchestration, automation, and response, SOAR platforms, with SIM automation, but also on-demand forensics, right? Having this ability when there's the point of alert to automatically reach out to a system in real time and grab information off of that host proactively in a way that is fast and light and agentless, and it gives the security team the ability to triage information very fast and very efficiently. This speed of incident response is just essential to optimizing these processes. So the proactive part of active defense, as you can see, is kind of built to the entire structure, right? Get at proactive about cyber hygiene around credential and connection information. Use this architecture, an agentless architecture that doesn't hand the advantage back to the attacker. Leverage deceptive methods as described in Shield and Engage to force your attacker to reveal themselves, and then automate incident investigation and on-demand forensics processes so that the burden on the security team is dramatically reduced, and that speed element is back in the hands of the security team rather than the attacker. So that was a lot of ground to cover. Frank, I'd love to get your comments as we bring the session to a close.
Yeah, I think the interesting perspective on this is just like the malware has improved over time, so is the use of deception, right? Because sometimes we lose perspective in terms of what deception is. And as we think back in terms of, the 2013, 14, 15 timeframe, we think of deception as just being honeypots, right? The thing that I like about deception in 2021 is that twofold. One, it's unique, right? It's not looking to address commodity ransomware. It's not looking for bad software. It's really looking to illuminate what I would call maliciousness in authorized traffic, it allows you as a security professional to illuminate those people that are fumbling through your networks and looking to touch on things and elevate privileges, and all of a sudden highlights those activities that illuminate the living off the land in what I would say, once again, authorized traffic. The second thing that I like about the approach, the alerts are so high fidelity. When you touch on particular areas of a network, or you go to leverage, a deceptive credential, it's darn near 100% that's bad. So as I'm sitting there as a security professional and I got 1,000 alerts to address, like something that uses a deceptive credential, boy, that jumps to the top of my list because it's so high fidelity. So for me, those are the critical attributes. It's the fidelity of the alert, and it's the ability to detect maliciousness in authorized traffic.
I think it's a great point, Frank, and I'll just give an example for the audience there. We can be specific about what we're talking about. In particular, I like your point around the difference between the malware and the process. So the modern security stack is going to leverage endpoint protection and EDR and different tools to look for malicious processes, maybe to not allow the use of, say, Minicat, right? To maybe you've got an Active Directory group policy to deny the use of Windows Credential Editor. So again, these are very much tools that one would use to memory scrape in order to pull credentials out of memory. Well, what do you do if the attacker builds their own tool that uses a new method? I mean, you're not going to see it. The attacker is going to be able to successfully scrape credentials and reuse that information. With the active defense approach, we're looking at that host on a consistent basis and automatically removing privileged credentials out of memory that don't need to be there. This is just an opportunity for an attacker to leverage this information, and so we've removed it. But then the second part is going back and planting a deceptive credential into memory so that if an attacker gets a hold of that system and they use some newfangled method of memory introspection to gather that credential and then use that credential in an attempt to authenticate on another system, we totally have them. It's, as you pointed out, a very high fidelity alert instance. Look, somebody is memory scraping to get at a credential and then actually using it in an attempt to move. And from a security perspective, we don't really care what tool you bring to the fight as far as a memory scraper goes. We're dealing with this at the data layer. And it just gives the security team a whole new level of understanding into that attacker intent and method.
Thanks, Wade. Well, that's about all the time we have for today's webcast. We give a big thanks to our speakers, Frank Dickerson of IDC and Wade Lance of Elusive, for sharing their expertise and insights with us. Thanks especially to you, our viewers, for tuning in. Please be sure to check out the resources section on your console for links to some valuable Elusive resources. Also be sure to check out the new IDC Spotlight report, Defeating Ransomware Requires a Deterministic Cybersecurity Game Plan. For Elusive, IDC, and IDG, I'm Tom Schmidt.